I'm Asger. You can ask me anything. Today I'm going to try and answer this question. How can you find the path of least resistance? The reason I'm even talking about this topic is that I was on a call with my friend Tammy, who some of you may know from my old YouTube channel, and we were talking about this mutual goal that we have to become completely financially independent. And she told me that she'd thought about what is the path of least resistance to this goal. And I found myself intuitively accepting this expression as logic. I thought about it as being more or less equal to just finding the fastest way from point A to point B. But that's actually not the case, I realized after thinking about it. So I've identified several problems with this approach, specifically with this specific goal in mind, but also with other things that you may want to accomplish. So let me just go over a few of them here. So first of all, we can't always see what the path with the least resistance is. We're going to return to that in a minute. Another potential issue, and this is very important actually, is that the path of least resistance isn't necessarily the most favorable or the shortest path. In fact, the path of least resistance can be a major detour. Let's just imagine that on the mountaintop, I trust you can see that mountaintop in the background there. There's a rock on the top of that mountaintop. And let's say, for the sake of this example, that the rock is completely spherical, that it's a perfect sphere. So at some point, it'll find its way to the bottom of the canyon over there. So this rock will inevitably always follow the path of least resistance. For the rock, it's not a choice, that's just the way it is. If let's just say we filmed this rock continuously, and let's say 20 years later, it's finally arriving at the bottom of the canyon. But if we plotted in the line, the route that it followed, would that be the fastest way from A to B? I mean, obviously not. That's just one problem with this concept. Also, applying the concept of path of least resistance to you trying to achieve your goals goes against everything I ever preached on this channel and my other social media channels. And that is, of course, that if you want to achieve something extraordinary, out of the ordinary, you must change your behavior to reflect that. In fact, check out my video on the biggest life hack, link somewhere around here. If you haven't seen it already, I talk in more details about that. But let's return to this concept. I was actually surprised to learn that some cognitive neuroscientists have actually explored this. So they designed this little computer game where people had like a little controller and they were supposed to steer a cloud of dots and really just very easy, going left or going right, just following the path of least resistance. And people were really good at that until the scientists pressed a little button that made the software have a directional load. So when they introduced this directional load, people stopped choosing the path of least resistance. But here's the point. They still thought that they chose the path of least resistance. In other words, it seems that we have an innate bias to think that that which seems most readily available to us, the lowest hanging fruit essentially, is also the same thing as the path of least resistance. But that is, of course, not necessarily true. I mean, it can be true, but it's not necessarily true. And I think in many cases, especially, let's just keep using this example to the goal of achieving financial freedom as an example, I think especially in those cases, it can be very easy to conflate one for the other. Be like water. You've probably heard this before. It was popularized by Bruce Lee many years back. That's essentially the same idea, right? But I think it's actually important to keep in mind what Bruce Lee was talking about. I mean, people obviously perceived it as a metaphor when he said this. On the battlefield or in combat, I think that concept makes way more sense than it does when we're trying to accomplish the counterintuitive, the non-low-hanging fruit, achieving the extraordinary. So is this concept completely worthless? I don't think it is, actually. I think there is value to be found here, and now we're arriving at my two biggest points. Sometimes the most obvious choice is not the choice that leads to the path of least resistance. That's essentially what the neuroscientists I mentioned a minute ago also concluded. Keep that in mind. What seems as the path of least resistance isn't necessarily actually the path of least resistance. It's a very important point. But the absolutely biggest lesson is this. When we encounter these common proverbs or ideas or idioms, such as find the path of least resistance, or with great power comes great responsibility, or actions speak louder than words, or beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and all good things must come to an end. When we hear all these things, we must pause for a second, especially before we use them to make important life decisions, such as how to apply your time and effort, or your money, or just important choices about the direction you're about to take. And don't get me wrong, I love idioms and proverbs. I really do. But quite often, they are a bit misleading. Think about it. What do they represent? They represent common ideas about how the world works. And that also means that because they're common, they are ideas that are held by almost everyone. And this actually tells us exactly what we need to know about them. They are commonsensical. They are great pointers in common situations. But in uncommon situations, such as the one you probably find yourself in, especially if you are striving to achieve financial independence, they can be very unhelpful. In fact, they can be detrimental to your success. I think most humans have this idea that if we have something, a sentence that sounds wise, or some piece of wisdom, or some piece of knowledge, it has to be applicable to all situations. But that's not given at all. I mean, we can find probably thousands of examples of some idiom that's pure gold in one context, but complete rubbish in another, right? But we do not notice the logic, the underlying logic here, unless we focus on it. Because these idioms are part of our culture, they're part of our languages, and because they're part of our languages, they're also part of the way we think. So do not apply common wisdom in uncommon situations. That is the main point I wanted to make here. And finally, I just want to reiterate the other very important point, that the path of least resistance is not the same as the shortest path. Let's say this is A, this is B, this is where you start, this is where you want to go. The path of least resistance can be like this. Now we're at B. Whereas the shortest distance is simply boom. And as a human being, we do not have unlimited time at our disposal. That is the biggest difference between me and the river over in the creek in the mountains behind me. So I'm going to conclude with saying, don't be like water. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, has value to me, and I'm betting probably also to you. And I'm Asger. You can ask me anything. Don't hesitate to ask your questions in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good one. Cheers.